This is the OpenChain Monthly North America and Europe meeting. This meeting is something that follows a structured agenda, and therefore you can expect a nice clear run through of a few items. We'll be going through the project news, we'll be looking at the standards and some education material, and then we'll have a space for any other business. The first thing we do at all these meetings, though, is to show the antitrust policy notice. The full Linux Foundation antitrust policy can be found on the website. And if you're from a member company, you can ask any questions of our counsel, Andy Updegrove. If you're not from a member company and you have any questions, please do direct them towards your own counsel. Now, onward to the recent news highlights. The news focuses on our project activity, and therefore we will be summarizing what we've done. Of course, there's been plenty of adjacent activity in, for example, conferences such as the Open Compliance Summit, which just happened last week in Japan. One of the people on the call, Yari, was there. It was great to have you over. And there's been other developments in projects like SPDX and so on and so forth. But we're focused on OpenChain. The context is that this call is the central call for the OpenChain project specification and for more generally the core activities of the project. So making specs and making reference materials. Plus, some room in the any other business for other projects to let us know what's going on. The core news for us this month, as every other month recently, is that we're in the center of a public comment period for proposed updates to ISO 5230, the international standard for open source license compliance, and ISO 18974, the international standard for open source security assurance. Everyone is probably aware of this who's dialed into the call, but for those who are watching the recording, for those who might be new, please be aware this public comment period is important. We will have it running for 6 months, and people can raise any comments they have on the draft proposed updates to the ISO standards during that time. The comments should be scoped and therefore focused on things like editorial or very concerning developments. Naturally, we don't have any particularly concerning developments. We're looking at gentle iteration based on market feedback over a period of, in the case of ISO 5230, 5 years. In the case of the security spec, around 2 years, and an editing process that took 2 years. Nice and stable. We like to drive a quiet oil tanker rather than a speedboat in this project. Right. The news beyond that is that we've seen some more adoption of our ISO standards. A highlight of a relatively local company to me, Osaka NDS, very recently announced adoption of ISO 5230, a supplier to automotive companies such as Honda. It's one of those companies in the middle of the supply chain that it's heartening to see adopt our standards. They join a growing list of companies that publicly share their work around adopting ISO 5230. And for those of you who may be new to our project and what's going on, that ISO standard in the last 5 years has seen significant adoption beyond public announcements. Recent survey by PwC indicated that 31% of large German companies had adopted or were planning to adopt ISO 5230. Even more exciting has been what's happened recently with ISO 18974, the international standard for security assurance. As mentioned at the previous meeting, we had some incoming large announcements. Korea Telecom is one of those. Honda is another. And Fujitsu, yet another. So we've had Korea Telecom, Honda, and Fujitsu all announce ISO 18974 programs in the last month or so. And that means they're all using the international standard for open source security assurance in aspects of their open source supply chain. I just want to pause here and say, congratulations, Chris. That's epic. Well done. Um,
Uh, I like it.
it's pretty good, isn't it? Here's our
Hmm.
here's our progress in the last well, year or so. The standard was publicly launched by ISO in December of last year. And we've had 12 companies announce that they're running programs using this ISO standard in that time. Again, bear in mind, these are people who come to us and say, we're using the standard. Please include our logo on your website. And you can see some fairly substantial organizations beyond those I've mentioned, such as LG Electronics, Samsung SDS, Kakao Bank, and BlackBerry, have kindly helped promote the standard by publicly discussing their adoption of it. So that's, I think, reasonable traction for a young standard. And again, well done to absolutely everyone involved. Right. We've had a lot of busy times in other parts of the OpenChain project. We have a relatively new SBOM study group that's been holding regular meetings once a month. The next one will be around the end of November. You can catch the last meeting using the QR code on this slide. By the way, the slides will be published alongside the video recording on our blog and news items a little bit later. AI study group, also been very busy. It just finished a meeting. I see Matthew's online, which means they've wrapped up their meeting at the hour. Matthew, I believe you'll have some news for us about AI study group. And what I'll do is I'll give you the floor during any other business. And if that's okay.
Cool.
Brilliant, brilliant. So AI study group just finished a meeting and there will be some news, but just for your reference, there's a good summary of what they were up to until the beginning of this month from their AI study group Asia Sync call. Now, I gave you a teaser that there's news from the AI study group, so bear with us. But we do have a little bit of work to do before we get there. We're going to have a look at the standards and core material. For reference, and for those parties who didn't see it last time, we recently had a steering committee meeting, and that means it's the platinum members of the OpenChain project, uh, plus an invitation, of course, for the chair of the spec group, to discuss where we're at with this group, the specification work group, and the project more generally. The steering committee meeting is public and there is a recording of it. What I want to do is highlight that these slides will, of course, link to it, but I'm going to put the link to this meeting into the chat once I can pull it out of our. Yes, if I can find the link. I do apologize. I'm a bit slow pulling up the link. I'm having some trouble with it. If I can't get the link, I have it. I've got it. Here we go. The link to the steering committee meeting is in the chat, and you'll also find it via the slides and whatnot if you need it. Now, you can track all of the open issues with the draft proposed updates to our specifications on GitHub, which is where we do everything. Long story short, my apologies, there are 3 open issues that we will address. There have been a lot of issues closed, and we have 3 open issues that we'll address today, none of which will take a great deal of time, but are important to formally cover. Previously, in prior meetings, when it comes to the ISO standard for open source license compliance, we closed out a bunch of issues, and in the chat, I will post a copy of the links to those issues for reference of the people online. All of those issues either fell into that's an editorial item and fits in the public comment period, or that's a scope item and it doesn't. Today, we have one item open for review. And it was originally raised in September, but wasn't added into our system until this call. That's on me. Not a super pressing issue per se, but an important one to talk about. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my browser. I'm going to post a link that's to the draft update of the license standard. And I'm going to show you the issue. I'm going to put the link to the issue in the chat as well. But the whole thing will be contained in the comment. And please note that this suggestion involves adjusting a sentence in the definition section of the standard to use the concept of examine rather than identify. And that sounds, this is my editorial, like a scope suggestion, which would be out of bounds for the public comment period, but may be something for the next iteration, or if it seemed very important, could essentially come in after the public comment period as a change and trigger a second public comment period. We currently have terms and definitions, and section 2.2 talks about a set of open source licenses identified as a result of following an appropriate method of identifying open source components. And various remixes were suggested, and all of the remixes changed identifying to examining, and then contain. Oh, sorry, discovered, and then contain, examining. My apologies, examining. So the question is, why would we want to do that? Under what situation and how? And there was a comment from Jeff on the original call that if we wanted to create a trust in the supply chain, rather than saying identifying, we might want to set lower bounds or expectations of data. And there, raise all the boats, our original goal. So in short, the suggestion was to change from identified license into examining to try to discover what they are. And the idea there would be trying to set lower bounds to capture more of the supply chain and then hopefully see the supply chain improve. It's a reasonable suggestion with clear logic, but the question, and that goes to the group today, and it goes to Chris, our chair, is it does sound like a scope suggestion, and therefore, what do we do with it? If there's no hard comment on this, by the way, if no one feels particularly strongly about commenting on this, the first thought would be to file the scope suggestion as a scope suggestion and place it under next iteration or to go before the steering committee to see if they would like to trigger a second public comment period after including the adjustment from identifying to examining. Comments, by
Well,
the way.
since
Oh, sorry.
since
Go ahead. My
uh,
apologies.
was there, I was just thinking from my perspective, I would prefer to leave it for the next iteration and try and dig down into what is meant by a lower level and see if we want to make some substantial changes to this rather than a second potential public comment period.
I think we might have Jeff on the line as well. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Hi,
Oh,
Shane.
Yep, he's there.
I'm trying to think why we talked about this. I think I'm looking at the identified license section. I think when we were having the comment on the September call, I think this came up because it was a double identify, We said the set
Right.
of open source licenses identified by identifying. And I think the clarification there was just for readability and removing of redundancy to change the second identify into examining. More of a kind of English editorial thing as opposed to any sort of philosophical difference, removing duplicative words.
Which is a very valid note indeed.
Hmm.
I think I think it wasn't much more than that. There wasn't a big philosophical discussion. It was more about, hey, it sounded a little clumsy to repeat this, fix
Yeah,
things by
and
fixing them.
yep, and that's always a pet peeve of mine is when they either reuse the same term as in the title over and over again in the definition, or if they use it twice in the definition. So yeah, that's a good thought. I like examining the open source licenses.
And I think, Shane, my second comment there about the supply chain, I think that was just a parenthetical, less about this particular identify comment, more about just supply chain comment in general.
And of course, it dovetails with the overall approach we've always had, which is let's try and scoop up the supply chain and raise all the boats, which has always been a general strategy. Yari, I see you're unmuted as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment, like, after Jeff's explanation that if this is just editorial change, then do we need to go some heavy lifting to get this through to the, I don't know, to next iteration or just make the adjustment of the current iteration and then do a second public comment period? Like, because I'm just thinking the next iteration, if it's coming 5 years from now, or when that would then happen.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's entirely possible that would be a 5-year pause. I suppose then, if we were to say that the intent is purely editorial,
Yeah.
the question that would come out is the closest possible change, and I'm just going to put them in here to make it easy to read. The closest possible change. Current is here, and proposed here. The closest possible change would swap out identifying for examining. It would be based on a set of open source licenses identified and still have a set of open source license as identified. Just a question of the appropriate method of identifying open source components or an appropriate method of examining open source components to contain the licenses. And if the intent is purely editorial, then the question would be very simply, how likely is it that someone would misread this? And that's really the only question. If we say it's purely editorial, there is no intent to change scope. The question would be, could anyone read it as a different scope? So that would be the question for us today. I don't know if you can read just on the screen. My apologies if you can't.
Yeah, I need the rest of the original paragraph to understand what we're looking for.
Right, I'll put the whole thing is good news, bad news. That is the whole paragraph. So I'll put this in the chat. It's simply one of the definitions, terms and definitions, section 2.2, and it's just one sentence long in both cases. Identified licenses are a set of open source licenses identified as a result of following an appropriate method of identifying open source components, which the supplied software may contain, and proposed that identified licenses would change to a set of open source software licenses identified as a result of following an appropriate method of examining open source components, which the supplied software may contain.
So where is identified licenses used in the body of the spec?
Let me see if I
Would be my question.
a good question indeed. Then is it not showing? Why is it not showing at all?
Yeah, it should show them both.
It should show them both. I'm not sure what's going on here because it's right there.
Yeah,
Right.
and then it's twice in the sentence below that.
Right. So
There
it's
it
in
is.
3.3 and under bill of materials, where it's talking about a process shall exist for creating and managing a bill of materials that includes each open source component and its identified licenses from which the supplied software, there's an error there, is may contain. That's an error which we picked up earlier and will be corrected in a GitHub submit. So in other words, it's used there. It's used in section 341 when it talks about a procedure that describes the process under which compliance artifacts are prepared and distributed with supplied software as required by the identified licenses. And yeah, further there, it's talking about identified licenses again. So it's used throughout the document. In other words, we use it multiple times.
And Shane, I think if I can jump in here real quick, I think as I'm kind of pulling from the recesses of my mind, I think one of the things that we talked about here was you might be able to find a license even if you haven't identified what the open source project is. Like I do a scan and I see a GPL license. I might not know that that is foobar version 1.2.3. I didn't identify the open source component, but I've examined the code base and I found a license that may be impactful to the SBOM, et cetera. So I think that was perhaps one of the reasons why we were trying to soften that language a little bit. You don't have to identify a component to have an identified license.
Right.
I don't think I'm, you know, I wouldn't go to the mat and over rotate on this particular point. I think it was kind of a little bit of an idea of can we soften it a little bit to make sure that people don't have to have 100% identification in order to send up a red flag. Oh, I see AGPL, I see GPL in something that I don't even know what it is, but I want to pass it on.
Right.
So a little bit more context of why we might want to soften identified to examined. But I also feel like, you know, if we have other more important things to do, we can move on.
Yeah, I don't think that the word examined instead of identified in that second location is going to it will get rid of the duplication of the use of the word identified, but it more properly defines when it's discovered during an examination.
Right.
So I'm not too hard over with not doing that. I think it does make it easier to read because you're not doing identified twice.
And I would also agree with that.
Okay, sounds good. What's the vote for? For changing or for leaving? Just to clarify. And then we can just ask the room, does anyone object to the proposed action?
This is Jeffrey. I would vote to change. I would say
Okay.
just a simple change from double identify to making the second one examining.
Good,
And
good.
you know, simple one word change. I don't think it changes the intent of it. I think it just makes it more readable and less redundant.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Does anyone disagree? Does anyone think that this is a scope suggestion, given that the intent is that it's not? Is everyone okay with proceeding? Because there was no intent to change scope, just editorial. Or does anyone have a concern?
Oh, this is good. This is just aesthetic and better readability. So it's good.
Everyone has had a chance to speak, and if there's no objections, then Chris, with your permission, we'll actually close with the update on that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Okay, that issue is closed, and I will update the spec in the background. Right, we do have more to do. So, we're on to the security spec. We had some stuff closed in September, October period, which I have just put into the chat for reference. We have 2 items to review today. Oops. Open items for review today. We have one bug, which should be a momentary decision to close, and one suggestion for improvement. And let me show these to you so that we have everything nice and tidy. So the first thing I'll do is I'm showing the security spec. This is the draft update. The link has gone into the chat. This is a document under editing, and that's what's in the public comment period. We have 2 comments today. One is a minor bug, and that's all it is. In the earlier version of the specification, there's a clear heading, terms, definitions, and examples, and it says, for the purposes of this document, the following terms and definitions apply, and then the definitions appear. In the current version of the Spec 2.0 draft, the above text was accidentally excluded, and it's that simple. Proposed solution is we just put it back into the text because it was accidentally cut out during one of the edit cycles. Let me show you. It should be right here, just above this, and it should just say 2 terms and definitions, which it does in prior versions of the text, and it's simply missing in this one. The question is, do you agree that adding the text header of terms 2 makes sense, or do you have an objection to fixing this bug?
Nope.
Seems like a typical normal goof in
Let's
the
fix.
Okay. Any objections to fixing the bug?
In any of the other specifications that I'm a participant in the committees on, ISO specs, ANSI specs, IEEE specs, that would get called out and added right back in there quickly.
Yeah. All right. We close with comment. So I'll update the spec after this call. The second one, which I'll throw into the chat, is actually more juicy, and that might take a minute or 2. Right. The summary is outside of our control. While we can mess around with our definitions and sections and whatnot, other people mess around too. And we found a change somewhere. We talk in our terms, definitions, and examples about software bill of materials, and we give an example about SPDX, Software Package Data Exchange. Now, our challenge is that Software Package Data Exchange, SPDX, has changed its name, and instead of calling itself Software Package Data Exchange, now called itself System Package Data Exchange.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, how should we address this? One option is to reference a precise version of the SPDX specification. Other options would be, I assume, for instance, not spelling out definitions, not referencing other things at all, and so on and so forth. Does anyone have any comments or ideas from other standards work on how to address this type of thing?
Yeah, I think that one approach would be is that we give the definition, and then as a bullet underneath it, we could list just some examples. In this case, there would just be one. I don't know why we didn't do that the first time. We should have. That way it would be agnostic. We're not trying to point anybody specifically to SPDX, but we're just listing it as an example with some other SBOM types, which we could just put down there as examples.
And if we do reference something like SPDX, do you think we should reference the exact version to circumvent the change their name in another version issue?
No, because if the spec has a lifetime of, say, 5 years
Right.
before it's going to drive it into repeated updates to try and keep up with the version changes on the software. That's my thought.
I would say that we put the only references to some projects instead of even mention the versions or naming. We cannot control these things.
We could just create a reference to another standard which talks in detail about SBOM rather than us providing even any example. We can just say this is what we intend to define as an SBOM, and for more details, we can refer to the other standard or the a European law or a US law, which talks more about it. We can just give that as a reference.
Shane, this is Jeff. I have two comments on this. One is, it's not quite a living document in the sense of we're not going to update it every millisecond that something changes. But SPDX has changed its name, and it is 2024, and we are in a time where we can make changes to the spec that don't affect, that are not big changes, but are more like typo and updates. And I would put this as a typo or update. If my name changed and I was in the spec, I'd like you to update the name. If I got married or something like that, and I think that's a equivalent thing here. The org changed its name. We should reflect its current name because it's a current spec. If we wanted to split the baby, we could say something like systems, system, SPDX using system and slash SPDX using software. It would just make it longer, and that would allow people to Google search their way to the spec. If somebody puts in the old name or the new name, they're still brought to our current spec. But I also don't think we need to be that specific. I would just vote for it's changed its name. We're in a time where we can make minor changes, and we should make a minor change to reflect its current name.
Yeah.
I have a point on that. See, that's a great idea, but one thing what we have been following in OpenChain from a long time, and in all the other documents, we have tried to keep it as agnostic as possible to any tool, any process, or any individual company, right? So SPDX is something which we are referring to explicitly, but there are other SBOMs as well.
Yeah, and I agree because we are talking even about the security assurance specification, and everyone knows that security is always for Cyclone DX between the SPDX and the version 3. So we're basically playing sides here very heavy. I don't like this.
Right. So it's better we keep it agnostic and we leave the specification to something that talks in more detail about this.
So should we change the whole text basically to say that there are some, I don't know, SBOM specifics and not even mention SPDX or Cyclone DX here?
I prefer.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
An
We don't
example.
mention any SBOMs here, any type of SBOMs here. Rather, we say you can go to this other standard and you can see everything in detail.
I suppose one example, I don't know. I don't know why Alan made the logo so big, but the CSAS definition. Just an example is a definition of S-bomb, and CISA's got that one. I suppose that's an option.
And I think that the definition of what is an S-bomb is also in the process of morphing itself. There's more different kinds of S-bombs depending on whether you're talking to a licensing person, a security person. It's V bombs and SS bombs. I mean, I've heard all kinds of crazy names out there recently. So I think we ought to try and keep the S-bomb definition more generic than precise. And yeah, I kind of agree that we shouldn't be including just one spec as if this is the only thing, but rather there's I'm trying to think of a good way to say this.
I suppose we
If
have
there
this.
was a good specification that actually defined what is the current state of what is an S-bomb, then I would think pointing to that specification is as was suggested a few minutes ago, probably the best idea. So we're pointing to a specification. We're not pointing to a specific instance that might be contained in that specification. And then that way people can go to the specification and look and see what kinds of different S-bombs there are and decide which one they want to use for their supply chain.
Okay. So,
Jeff or Jerry, you have any comments on that?
This is Jeff here. I mean, I do agree that we want to be careful that we're not putting our thumb on the scale saying we prefer one format versus another.
Mhm.
I do, it is good to be, I'm also, specific is terrific. When we talk about S-bombs, we're talking about something that's more like SPDX or Cyclone DX than some other, not good enough spec.
Right.
But we don't have it'd be interesting to see like what the CRA says right now around SBOM formats. I'm taking a look real quick. I guess I would say either yank it or give two or three examples. If we're going to say SPDX, Cyclone DX, and SWID, for example, that may be too much. Like why those three as opposed to Omnivore and this and that. Like there's someone's going to feel left out if we don't put their name in the spec.
I think CRA mentions SPDX and Cyclone, nothing else today, if I remember correct.
Yeah, maybe currently approved SBOM tools. I don't know, something along that line, because there probably will be another approved version of an SBOM generating tool. What it contains is always a subject of conjecture until it comes out. But in talking with our customers, there are a lot of different SBOMs that they refer to, and they're very specific about it because that's all they care about in their narrow frame of reference. So, and some of those SBOMs are, starting to take root in public discourse, but they're not really accepted types of SBOMs yet.
that's a very good point.
I think I would be okay just removing the entire sentence that starts with an example is, and just have, I think our SBOM definition is pretty good if we just say it's an inventory for software, a list of ingredients, blah, 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 remove the next sentence, and then still says, regardless of the SBOM specification used, it should follow blah, blah, blah. Like, I think that's a strong paragraph, and then we don't upset any, SBOM with having a definition and an acronym and a brief explanation and a caveat, which is what we give in this paragraph. That's enough for people to know what we're talking about. I don't think it's ambiguous. Giving an example of SPDX is not required for people to understand that what we're talking about.
Okay, that's an interesting point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I put it in the chat so everyone could read it quickly as well. So that's an option that we just cut the middle sentence. And it just becomes a software bill of materials. SBOM is an inventory for software, a list of ingredients that make up software components. Regardless of the SBOM specification used, it should follow a complete profile for the intended use case.
I like it.
Yeah, that's clean.
Okay. Does anyone have
And
any?
we don't know, what sort of SBOM formats they are in 4 years from now. So
We have no idea.
yeah.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
Right. Group. So the final decision, do we just do that and proceed like that, or does someone object to that approach?
Oh, this looks good.
Yeah, and anyone can object, by the way. There's no peer pressure here. The whole purpose of this is to to object or not.
And this statement actually makes it easier. European companies follow what is approved in CRA. US companies follow what is approved in NIST or NTIA documents.
That's correct.
I must admit that getting more granular always worries me a tad because we are very global. And for instance, CISA's excellent work and definitions and the guidelines from NIST are invaluable, but they are coming from one geography, and we do have a whole planet. So it is possible people will ask for different things in different places.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting news. I think this was discussed in other platforms as well. Now, the Indian government has also started taking interest in SBOMs, and they have started listing it in their official documents. So, yeah, a lot of new things coming up.
Okay, I'm putting down all in favor because I heard no one against. In which case, I will close with the comment, update the draft document, but anyone still has plenty of time to come back and say no. I don't like that. Now, there is a question if that update is valid inside the public comment period. And that question would be, is it an error or is it necessary for clarity? My understanding from this talk is that people see it as potentially necessary for clarity. Either we'd have to go down a rabbit hole of considerable adjustment, or we can snip out some text to make it clear. Did I hear correctly? Do people concur with that?
Yes.
Jeff here says yes.
Okay, I'm going to close with that comment. And if anyone has any objection, come back at any time and reopen it. Well, fantastic work. We had 3 items open and we closed all 3. Now, because we want to give some time to AI, I'll just make a note that the education work group has continued meeting. Ooh, my dear, this is going on. There we go. The education work group has continued meeting and they're working on capability modeling, maturity modeling. And that work is now very mature. They're essentially in a beta release of public domain reference maturity modeling for ISO 5230. And that would give everyone access to the type of maturity modeling that may be useful. I must give a call out here, not only to Andrew Katz from Orcro, who's the chair of education, but also to contributors from Deloitte who lent a hand with making this happen. Is the document finished? No. Is it nearly done? Yes. It's a final release candidate, and everyone's welcome to dive in. Links in the chat. Now, the any other business, we've been doing a ton of AI compliance stuff. For example, we had a webinar on the AI legal landscape. That was GTC Law, and they were very, very good at covering a huge amount of ground, and there were plenty of questions. We had a webinar with Nick, who is ex-Microsoft and now leading a company in the AI domain. He was talking about the role of data in the supply chain of AI. Beyond webinars, we have an AI study group co-chaired by Matthew on the call here, and Dave, who isn't here today. Matthew just chaired a meeting of the AI study group, which has been working on some interesting documents. What I'm going to do is very quickly throw in the AI study group document. So Matthew's talk will have some context. They've been working on a document. Link is now in the chat. And this work has been to try and understand essentially AI compliance in the supply chain. Are there commonalities with what we've done with our ISO standards? And with those commonalities, if any, is there something for us to do here? And to go from studying the question to working on it, maybe producing guidance material. Matthew, I'll stop there and hand over to you so you can let people know where thinking is at. And I think you might have an update regarding what's...
I appreciate that, and I think you've given a really good summary of the history of this study group over the last 12 months. I think we've been going, and ultimately resulted in the documentation that's being shown on screen here, where we're hoping to produce some guidelines or guidance around AI bill of material management. And we have got to a consensus now where we have a proposal to change the AI study group into an AI working group. And the proposal was presented today to the team. We'll have a bit of time just bouncing around the ideas, and we'll go through the formal process of the proposal moving to a working group. But the idea and the main objective of the working group, if it's approved by the board, would be to focus on this guidelines for AI bill of materials, but we also wanted to touch on a few other aspects around attestation of AI work, and also looking at the differences or comparing the comparisons of an AI bill of material and a model card. So there's plenty of good things that we feel as though we can help contribute to the ecosystem and the supply chain, ultimately building trust with this guidance. And it's great that we're moving from this, potentially moving from one stage of the study group to the working group, which will allow us to have a bit more discussions around what we want to try and achieve.
Is
that fair enough, Shane?
That's brilliant. And, you know, I might, if it's okay, I might dive in with a question or two. Ahead of that, just in case anyone is totally new to this, we're not making an AI bomb. As Matthew said, we're looking at how to manage those in the supply chain. So, you know, just like we've done before, the type of process management discussion of if you're dealing with something like an AI bomb, how do you manage that? Inbound, internal, outbound, training, responsible staff, etc. And you know, Matthew touched on that. It's been very clear. The reason I raise it is simply because quite a few parties are working on AI and AI bomb, and I don't want anyone to get confused with overlap. Matthew, the formal procedure for going from a study group, which is officially speaking just noodling on something, to a work group, which is actually working on, let's say, a guide, is to submit a proposal to the governing board. And it's great news to hear that there's consensus in the study group to do so. Doing that, naturally, I'll be on hand to help. are you also soliciting, contributions and engagement more broadly from the spec work group and other parties to join in?
I think it's a great opportunity and a great time for those interested in AI compliance to come and here's some of the work that's going on. Lots of good discussions from lots of great people. Also an opportunity, if you wish, Shane and the chair, for us to present elsewhere.
Oh, yes. Yes, please. I mean, I think we all have to learn a lot more about this. Do you think it would be possible to do an OpenChain webinar to summarize the current status? I realize that would be recapping a lot, but it's a question, not a formal request.
I don't see the reason why we can't. Who does this? When we do this, let's discuss that offline.
Sounds good. Chris, a question as someone deeply experienced in this field. I mean, what's on the table right now isn't to write a new standard on AI bill of material management, but rather to look at making some reference material. And in some senses, that's like the very early days of security, where we first wrote a guide saying, look, the license standard can be useful for security with XYZ type of adjustments. And this would also be a guide. When it comes to writing a guide and not being sure where the market will go, you never know if the guide could eventually morph into a standard and so on. Do you have any guidance based on your experience of, how this could be approached and, how to make sure that we try to include people and how to make sure we don't lose our direction in a fast moving new field where everyone is excited? No guidance necessary, of course. It's just an open-ended question. And because of your experience in committees, Chris, I thought, there might be somewhere that you could give us a few notes and pointers, if not now, perhaps later.
Yeah, I'd be glad to.
Interesting thing, I suppose, pulling back and looking at the supply chain, Matthew, this is something you raised, and this is before we started the study group. Both you and Dave Marr over at Qualcomm raised it. So many people are talking about putting AI XYZ into the supply chain that managing it, however you want to manage it, but having frameworks to manage it looks increasingly important. And over the last year, Matthew, you've led an awful lot of discussion on this. It seems that the management of all the suppliers going crazy about AI ideas and everything from models to whole solutions to whatever, it seems like the management of that remains an outstanding issue.
Certainly from the conversations I hear and the discussions that we have, and I think OpenChain is really well positioned to provide that guidance to the ecosystem.
And of course, we're not looking at a target that has settled itself, but we are looking at something that has more material appearing around it. So I'm just going to highlight here this existing ISO standard, Artificial Intelligence Management System. And very recently, I'm just going to pull something up last week at the Open Compliance Summit in Tokyo. There was a presentation by some people from Fujitsu, and I'm going to put the presentation into this chat. I just published about the presentation today. The presentation took place last week, and the presentation was from Fujitsu. But what was interesting is they were talking about AI management system standardization, and they referenced the discussion of AI management, and they were talking about this JTC1 Subcommittee 42 working on this topic, and their activity in that, how they worked on 42001, and so on and so forth. So what we were talking about was touching on this 42001, and they went into a deep dive about how they were working on this topic. And that news, their slide deck is in the chat. They were talking about developing amendments to existing standards. If I can try to full screen this, I don't know, it's not working. They were talking about amendments to existing standards like ISO 22989, that's AI concepts and terminology, and ISO IEC 23053, a framework for AI systems using machine language, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's funny because I'm working with ANSI and ISO on those exact ones right at the moment.
Well, you are the right person in the right place.
as part of the U.S. TAG or Technical Assistance Group.
That's fantastic. So I guess, Matthew, this might be simplifying it too much, but where you've been looking at with the team at 42001, and Fujitsu talking about tying that into what else has happened on other standards. What we'd be looking at is at the layer above this, all of these standards for doing things like management systems, AI concepts, and so on. You now have a pile of standards. What do you do? And that seems to be what the AI study group is thinking of for the supply chain. Would that be a quick summary of some of the thinking going on? Oh dear, we might have had Matthew drop off the call. He had a computer issue earlier. Right. Next steps then, Matthew comes back with more detail, more in-depth presentation. Chris, fantastic to hear that you're working on the AI concepts and terminology and the framework for AI systems. Basically then it sounds like their notepad should be brought before the spec committee and so on, so we keep abreast of it. What they're looking at doing isn't making a spec at this juncture, but rather looking at what's out in the space, what OpenChain has done on process management that can help, and looking at all of those standards and thinking, what do we do with this jigsaw if we're a company in the supply chain saying, which seems like a reasonable thing to do. They'll make a proposal, they'll submit it to the board and steering committee, and they will either get approval to become a work group or not. It's more than likely they shall. And they'll start working on a guide on how to put all these pieces together. So that's the any other news, and quite an important thing it was. Right. With that, we're at the hour. It's the close of meeting time. Does anyone have any other business that they wish to raise today? If not, I want to say thank you for an extremely productive meeting. Chris, special thanks as always for your steadfast guidance on what's good to do and not. Special thanks to Jeff for running through details and dragging up some background, and to all the other contributors and participants. I'll see some of you in 2 weeks as we do North America, Asia, and the rest of you next month as we wrap up the year. I do apologize for my occasional verbal stutters. It's 2 a.m. here and I'm flagging. Japan is unfortunately on the wrong side of the time zone. Have a beautiful day. Take care, stay healthy, and talk soon.
Okay. Get some sleep.
I shall indeed.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.